I never thought my own flesh and blood would make me a stranger. At his most important celebration, the lavish wedding reception smelled of expensive white roses and high-end cologne, but to me, the air felt completely unbreathable. Standing alone near a massive marble pillar, I watched hundreds of guests marvel at the elegant decorations and shimmering lights that filled the grand ballroom. My son intentionally avoided looking in my direction all evening, and that heavy silence cut deeper than any physical blow. When he finally walked over and shouted for me to leave, his voice carried a rehearsed cruelty that paralyzed the room. The sudden outburst made nearby guests gasp in complete disbelief, while others quickly averted their eyes to avoid the awkward confrontation. I refused to say a single word because speaking up would have shattered the quiet dignity I spent a lifetime building inside myself. Turning away, I walked out of the venue with slow, deliberate steps that felt incredibly heavy with decades of memories. The crisp night air hit my face like a harsh reality check the moment I stepped outside into the dark parking lot. Sitting alone in my vehicle, I vividly remembered teaching him how to take his very first steps. Back then, I held his tiny hand tightly so he would never have to experience a painful fall. Sitting in the dark, a heartbreaking realization washed over me as I understood that I had been holding his hand for far too long. I stayed supportive, even when he clearly no longer needed my guidance or wanted my presence in his life. When I finally reached my empty house, the familiar living room walls felt closer and more suffocating than ever before. Pouring a glass of water, I noticed my hands were trembling so violently that the liquid spilled over the edge. Unresolved memories flooded my mind without warning or permission, forcing me to relive the hardest moments of my past. I remembered the exact night his father passed away. When I looked at my boy and promised I would be both parents for him, I thought about the years I worked exhausting double shifts at the hospital, returning home completely drained but always forcing a bright smile. I did it so he would never feel the heavy burden of our financial struggles or feel guilty about our reality. On his birthdays, I always made sure he had a wonderful gift, even if it meant buying nothing for myself. I truly believed I had raised a man who understood the core values of respect, empathy, and genuine appreciation. Yet, somewhere along his journey into adulthood, he had completely discarded those lessons and developed a toxic sense of entitlement instead. As the early morning light began to peek through the window blinds, I sat on the edge of my bed and accepted a very painful truth. Sometimes, loving someone too much and protecting them from every hardship only teaches them the wrong lesson about how the world actually works. The kitchen telephone rang early the next morning while I was quietly brewing a cup of chamomile tea. My son's voice sounded incredibly cold and strictly transactional when he demanded that I hand over the family property deeds immediately. He never bothered to mention the dramatic incident at the wedding, nor did he ask if I was doing okay after the public humiliation. A strange sense of profound calmness settled over my spirit as I listened to his entitled demands through the receiver. After hanging up, I stared at the wooden cabinet where I kept the legal documents that represented decades of personal sacrifice. Opening the door, I ran my fingertips across the envelope before firmly closing it. Without taking anything out, that simple action felt like reclaiming a precious piece of my identity that I had willingly surrendered a long time ago. When my son arrived at the house a few hours later, his intense frustration completely filled the quiet room. He spoke incredibly fast, placing the blame for his behavior on wedding stress, his new wife, and the overall chaos of the event. I listened to his frantic excuses without interrupting, keeping my facial expression completely unreadable the entire time. Then, I spoke calmly about the deep pain of being publicly discarded, while complete strangers watched my heart break. I did not raise my voice or hurl angry accusations because I knew my quiet composure would rattle him far more than anger. When I firmly told him that respect mattered infinitely more than any future inheritance, he let out a bitter laugh and stormed out. I wept quietly after the front door slammed shut. Not because I regretted my words, but because standing your ground hurts most when it is right. As the days quickly turned into weeks, I consciously stopped checking my smartphone for his missed calls or text messages. Instead, I began filling my open schedule with personal activities that I had foolishly postponed. For a number of years, I started taking long morning walks through the park, reconnecting with old high school friends, and spending quiet afternoons reading books. Slowly but surely, the heavy weight that had settled deep inside my chest began to lift into the atmosphere. I eventually learned through extended family members that his new marriage was already experiencing an immense amount of tension. Frequent arguments regarding financial choices, marital control, and social power were quickly becoming a daily routine for the newlyweds. I chose to stay completely silent, knowing that any interference would only delay the vital lesson that life was trying to teach him. One rainy evening, my son returned to my doorstep completely unexpected and looking visibly exhausted. From his current life circumstances, the arrogant confidence he usually carried himself with now showed visible cracks that he could no longer hide from me. He spoke candidly about his sleepless nights, the constant arguing at home, and a deep sense of emptiness he could not explain. I sat quietly and listened to his vulnerability, without interrupting his train of thought a single time during the conversation. When he predictably brought up the property deeds again, my response remained completely steady and entirely unchanged. I told him that love, without mutual respect, is simply a form of toxic control disguised as genuine care. This time around, he did not argue with my logic or storm out of the house in a fit of rage. He left the property quietly, carrying an emotional burden that was far heavier than mere disappointment or anger. A profound realization was finally beginning to take root inside his mind after months of stubborn resistance. Following that emotional night, a thick wall of silence settled between us that neither of us actively tried to dismantle. Weeks turned into months without a single phone call, text message, or cheap excuse from his side of the family. I gradually learned how to comfortably exist within that quiet space, even though it felt incredibly unnatural at the beginning. At first, navigating the complete isolation was deeply painful, resembling the physical struggle of trying to breathe with only one lung. But as time progressed, that agonizing silence slowly transformed into a beautiful sense of personal peace and daily tranquility. I began completely reorganizing my living space, donating old belongings, and discarding physical items that held memories I no longer needed. I even repainted his childhood bedroom, consciously choosing bright colors that brought me personal joy. Instead of pleasing a child, every single stroke of the paint roller felt like successfully reclaiming my own personal territory after years of neglect. In the quiet moments of the evening, maternal guilt tried to creep into my mind, whispering that a mother should always give. It told me that I should instantly forgive every mistake. But I reminded myself that giving without boundaries had caused this mess. Somewhere far away from my quiet home, my son was finally learning the true cost of the selfish choices he made. His marriage, which he had previously displayed to society like a shiny trophy, was rapidly cracking under its own immense weight. The woman he chose to marry valued personal power far more than equal partnership, and demanded control rather than showing genuine care. Their daily arguments quickly became a routine part of their life, and household finances were constantly weaponized during every disagreement. He realized far too late that the exact same dismissive attitude he used against me was now being used against him. Every single domestic dispute echoed my warning words back into his mind. Words he had previously dismissed as emotional manipulation. Late at night, sitting completely alone in his dark apartment, he constantly thought about the wedding day and my silent exit. That specific memory haunted his conscience far more than any loud argument he currently endured. Within his failing marriage, one breezy afternoon, he showed up at my front door once again. Without sending any advanced warning of his arrival, I watched through the window as he stood outside on the porch for a very long time before knocking. When I finally opened the door, I saw a profound sense of hesitation in his eyes that I had not seen since childhood. He tried to speak casually at first, making awkward comments about the house renovations and the weather to avoid the truth. I simply stood there and allowed him to speak until he finally admitted that he was struggling immensely with life. He confessed that absolutely nothing felt stable anymore. So I opened the door wider and warmly invited him inside. I listened to his problems, not as a protective rescuer looking to fix things, but as an equal adult. For the very first time in his adult life, he did not ask me for a single favor or demand anything. That complete absence of selfish entitlement spoke much louder than any scripted apology he could have ever put together. Our weekly conversations slowly began to shift in a much healthier and more meaningful direction as time went on. He started asking insightful questions about my life experiences instead of constantly making arrogant statements about his own wisdom. He asked how I managed to navigate life completely alone for so many years after losing his father so suddenly. He wanted to know how I stayed strong and endured the crushing weight of loneliness without turning bitter against the world. I answered his questions with absolute honesty, refusing to romanticize the difficult journey or sugarcoat the reality of my past. I told him about the terrifying fear, the physical exhaustion, and the exact moment I nearly gave up entirely. Through those vulnerable talks, he finally realized that true human strength was not about dominance, but about quiet endurance. Each subsequent visit successfully stripped away another thick layer of arrogance that he did not even realize he was carrying. Eventually, the one specific topic that he feared discussing the most naturally surfaced during our Sunday afternoon conversation. The property deeds. This time, his voice did not carry a single hint of demand, sounding incredibly cautious and genuinely ashamed instead. I looked him in the eyes and explained clearly that the family land was never meant to be a punishment. It was also never meant to be a reward for good behavior, but was always a massive lifelong responsibility. I explained that inheritance is not a birthright earned by blood, but a sacred trust that must be earned through character. If the day ever came where I felt he was truly capable of protecting people rather than property, the papers would matter. Until he reached that level of personal maturity, those documents were nothing more than ordinary pieces of paper with ink. He nodded his head in silent agreement, finally understanding, for the first time, that power without values is completely hollow. Several months later, official news reached my home that his tumultuous marriage had completely collapsed and ended in divorce. He did not come running to my house, immediately looking for financial shelter or an easy escape from his reality. When he finally did visit weeks later, it was not to ask for money or a place to stay. He came simply to sit on the porch, talk through his feelings, and reflect deeply on his life choices. He openly admitted that he had become someone he did not recognize, a man who confused control with actual strength. He apologized to me once again, but this time his words carried no underlying fear of losing his future inheritance. I accepted his apology slowly and carefully, Knowing that forgiveness does not instantly erase the painful memories of the past, rebuilding true trust would require a significant amount of time, consistent behavior, and a healthy dose of daily humility. In the end, there was no massive dramatic reunion, no emotional tears in the rain, and no sudden magical solutions. There were just two adults learning how to patiently rebuild a relationship that pride had completely broken apart. I did not win the conflict by withholding the property from him. I won by successfully teaching my son dignity. And he did not simply lose a financial inheritance on the day of his wedding. He lost his toxic entitlement. Through that loss, he gained